one of the things I always ask people is like, what is a cartoonist? So this is kind of how I became a cartoonist, but I always like to start by saying, what is a cartoonist? If you know, then you can just hold on to it, and I'll come back to this at the end. But people have a tendency to think a cartoonist is a person who is a cartoon, which has actually happened. Kids have asked me, are you a cartoon? And I'm like, no, I'm a real life person. A person who is in a cartoon, which actually happens sometimes because I do draw comics that I have myself in them. A person who writes and draws stories. I would say that I am the person who writes and draws stories. This is my second grade teacher, Miss Norton. Miss Norton is the person that I credit with, one, making me not trust all teachers, and two, making me love to read books. Miss Norton was evil. And when I look back on my time with Miss Norton, I realized that this woman this was probably about 82, 83, when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And so Miss Norton was probably in her 60s. She had grown children at this point. So I know that she would have started her tenure teaching in segregated schools. So she would have taught at the segregated, Liam Wade, the elementary school that I went to, was the all-black school. So she would have probably been transferred from a different school to this school because it would have been it was the all-black school before. So she had no experience with Black kids. She'd only had like 8 years worth of experience with Black kids. And so I think that had a lot to do with what she did. But one of the things she did for us is she wrote to us every day. And she even introduced me to the library for the first time, which was like the library opening up for me as a kid was like opening up a book. I mean, it was the equivalent of a toy store. You ever been to a library and you see the kids section? So I grew up in the projects in Southwestern Virginia. So like, I didn't go to toy stores very often. So like being able to walk up the street and find this place that had like books and stories and all this other stuff meant that was a place that I spent a lot of time in. And I spent a lot of time drawing comics and reading comics. But the other thing that sort of cemented my idea of a storyteller was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. You guys can't see it, but I have an original 1983 in the box He-Man Castle Grayskull. That's the castle in the back. Costs a lot more than $25 now. But I have an original one in the box right over here. And I always describe He-Man as like the Pokemon of the 80s because it was like a whole bunch of them, right? There was like He-Man and Skeletor and Panther and Prince Adam and like Moss Man. There was all these different types of He-Man, right? And you had to get them all. And we would go outside and play at the various basically piles of dirt. Most of the things, it was like little random piles of dirt that kids would play at. There was a couple of playgrounds, but we, of course, kids will always play in wherever they could, right? And so everybody would go outside and play with their He-Man. I was poor. I didn't have any He-Man action figures. So people would always say to me, where are your He-Man figures at? And I used to say they were at my grandma's house. They're like, do you have Castle Grayskull? I'm like, it's at my grandma's house. Do you have Wind Raider? It's at my grandma's house. Everything that I own was at my grandma's house. And when I look back on that I realized that was me telling another story. And it was me telling a story about the kid that I wanted people to see when they saw me, not the kid who was actually there. So it was me trying to manipulate and tell the story of who I was. But when looking back on that, I realized that all those other kids were telling the exact same stories too. They would always say their stuff was, where's your Atari? It's at my grandma's house. Like everybody was telling the exact same story with some variation about what they wanted people to see when they saw them. But loving stories, man, I was in love with comics at a really early age. And one of the things that was interesting is that when I bought comics, I wouldn't just buy like a floppy, right? These are like 40 cents for like, I think they were probably like 75 cents when I was a kid. They were still pretty cheap, but I wouldn't buy these because they only had one story in them. And so I would typically lean toward buying like Cracked or Mad Magazine because they were longer. I could spend $3 and I would get like, a couple weeks worth of stories that would take me that time to read them. As opposed to these, which I could read in like 10, 15 minutes, right? So like the story's almost over. So I spent a lot of time reading those. And I also read a lot of, I don't know if some of the older people on this call would understand it, but they used to have these little comics that were like this big. And they were Ripley's Believe It or Not comics. They were the collected volumes from the newspaper, and they were little hardcover books. And I think these books were probably from the late 60s, early 70s, because they were all beat up. But I would read tons of Ripley's Believe It or Not comics and all these nonfiction comics, which eventually led me to go to college because I wanted to be a cartoonist. But the school that I went to, they didn't have, let me back up. Well, I'll back up a little bit and tell you this one interesting story. I went to college thinking that I wanted to draw comics, but they didn't have comics, so they had a graphic design program. But I also didn't have a high school diploma. In Virginia at the time, you could go to college because they were trying to get like the old people who were out of they were laid off because of factories that were closing down, trying to get them back into the workforce so that you could go to school without a high school diploma if you were of a certain age, like if you were 18 and no longer could be claimed on your parents' taxes. And I was married when I went to school. So I qualified for this program. And so I went to school and I took a graphic design program because it was the only thing that they would accept. There's the only thing that they had that was art related. So I took the graphic design program and eventually fell in love with painting along the way. And so I decided to go to college for painting. And at the time, I didn't have a high school diploma, but I had like a 3.7 GPA at the community college, and I already had my associate's degree. And so I got in, I got a scholarship, got accepted. Classes were going to start like the next week at the Roanoke College, and they were like, "Joel, we need a copy of your diploma." And I said, "I don't have a diploma." And they said, "Well, we can't let you come in unless you have a diploma." And I'm like, "Where am I going to get a diploma before Monday?" And they were like, "Well, maybe you can go out to it was 2 weeks. So maybe you can go out to the night school." So they gave me the name of the night school. I went out there and met with the principal. His name was Mr. Ball. And he looked at my transcripts from the community college. He's like, "Well, you have everything here. There's nothing that we can actually do for you. So how about you just, how about we give you a test in world history?" And I'm like, "All right, I can do that. World history, right?" So he's like, "Come back on Wednesday." So I came back the following Wednesday. Classes are going to be starting the following Monday. So I come back on Wednesday, and the principal and the proctor for the test was my high school English teacher. He was like one of those really cool English teachers. Like at the time, like these pants that everybody was wearing were called skids. They were like these giant hammer pants. They were one size fit all. Everybody was wearing them. And so he would wear these to school. He was like the coolest teacher, right? And Mr. Powell was his name. Mr. Powell was the proctor for the test. And he was like, "Oh, this is good to see you, Joel." So he gives me this test. They didn't give me a book or anything. They just said, like, "Go home, come back and take the test." So at the best part of this story, when the hero does this, it's like, I was so smart and brilliant that I passed this test automatically, right? No, he came back in and he handed me the test back and he goes, "Joel, now that you know some of the wrong answers, see if you can find some of the right ones." And so I took the test again. And then the second time he came back with the principal of the night school. And I remember he leaned up against the table and he says, "Joel, do you need to impress Roanoke College, or do you just need a diploma?" And I said, I really just need a diploma. And he looked at the principal and he goes, "Just give him the damn diploma." That's how I got my high school diploma. I went on to be a summer scholar at my college. And then I got a full ride to BU to go to grad school. When I got to BU and I went to grad school, I was like very insular. Like we were all doing it. We were just basically, it's just me and my family. So this is my wife and kids. The two paintings on the left-hand side I did while I was at grad school. The one on the right I did about 7 or 8 years ago of my son because he didn't have a singular portrait. And my wife was like, "We need to have a portrait in the house to match his." So I had to do this portrait of my son. But in the process, when I left grad school, I was doing these series of paintings called Strange Fruit. And the paintings that I did were about like the idea of moving from the South to New England, and then from New England back to the South, and coming to terms with this idea that even though I live in New England now, that I am a Southerner. If I had to choose a place right now to live, like infinite resources, all of my family, I would live in the South, right? Because I'm a Southerner. But I guess like the best way to think about being a Southerner and being in love with the South especially being a Black man and being in love with the South. It's kind of like, you know, like you meet a drug dealer and y'all fall in love and you get married. There's just some stuff y'all don't talk about, right? So like, that's what like being in love with the South as a Black man is. It's like just stuff you just don't talk about. And so I went back and I started doing these paintings called Strange Fruit, which was like this idea based on the Billie Holiday song, which is, you know, Black people have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And so I did this painting of myself with a noose around my neck, and the noose was frayed, and it was called Strange Fruit, He Cut the Rope. And it was kind of like a symbolism of like, you know, Black people have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. You know, like I'm still having to like, you know, I still get people saying, oh, you're articulate for, you know, like for a Black man. Oh, you're a professor? Oh, like you look like you could have been a football player. Those type of things. And a friend of mine came to that show, which was really successful, sold some paintings. People wrote about it. It's like the television interviews. And my friend was like, looks like your paintings are trying to tell stories and they're failing. And so I went back to the idea of how do you tell stories? Like, I want to tell stories. Like as a kid, I wanted to be a storyteller. I'm still trying to tell stories now. So how do I do that? And it was about that time I saw this interview. I heard this interview on NPR with Chris Ware. Chris Ware is an amazing cartoonist, who's the only cartoonist to win the Guardian Prize for literature, for a comic. And he made these amazing comics that weren't superheroes. And that sort of piqued my interest. And so I spent a lot of time researching and trying to come to this conclusion about how to tell stories and how to draw comics to tell stories. So I started drawing this story called Dandelions, which was like this metaphor of my life, but it was magic realism. It wasn't really it wasn't a memoir. It was just kind of based on it. And a friend of mine, who's a cartoonist now, was looking through the books that I'd had. I just met him, right? And he was looking through my pages and pages of Dandelions, which was like 30 or 40 pages. He's like flipping through like this. He's like, I'm like 30 pages into this and I have no idea what I'm reading. So like it dawned on me that I needed to learn more. So I went and started like researching more. So I got more into like older cartoons. I'm really interested in like cartoons before like 1920s and 30s. The one on the left is Little Nemo and Slumberland. It's about this kid who goes on these amazing adventures in his dream, and they're beautiful. And they were drawn over the course of like, he drew these every Sunday for like 13 or 14 years. The one on the right is Joe Sacco, who is a nonfiction like comics reporter. He goes to places. This is from Palestine, but he goes to places and then he makes a comic based on those things that he experienced. So he's just like, it's like reporting, but it's comics. And at the same time, I decided I would get myself a library degree in comics. And if you don't know what a library degree is, it's when you have a library card and you have determination. And you go to the library and you read everything you can about a specific subject. And I did that with comics. And then I started doing that with individual artists. So I would research individual cartoonists and comic book artists, and I would try to find out as much as I could about them. And I ran across this cartoonist named Box Brown. Box Brown's most recent book is this book called Child Star, which is really great. So if you haven't picked it up, you should. But most of his books are all nonfiction. So he did a book on Tetris. He did a biography of Andre the Giant. He did one on Andy Kaufman. He did a book called Cannabis, Legalized Weed in America. Just really, really interesting, thought-provoking books that he's done. But before, he was just an indie cartoonist, just drawing stuff and putting it online. So I sent him a message. Well, I Googled him, just trying to find out more about him. And when I Googled him, a man named Henry Box Brown showed up. Henry Box Brown is an enslaved African who, in order to escape from slavery to freedom, mailed himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia. So I knew, because I'd been cyber stalking Box Brown, so I knew that he was a white kid in Philadelphia. So I sent him a message. Why are you a white kid in Philadelphia with the name of this enslaved African man? And he responded. He was like, that's, haha, that's funny. I'm just square shaped, so my friends call me Box. But I might draw a comic about that guy someday. And I've been struggling with trying to figure out how to tell a story. And I'm like, that's a really good idea. I'm going to tell that story. So I stole his idea. And I drew the story of Henry Box Brown. And because comics are different than any other art form, in that there's no barrier between you and the person that you want to sell comics to. You just have to make the comic and go find a place where people are selling them. So that's what I did. I made a book, and I made these little mini comics that I called Strange Fruit, based on the comics that I did, based on the series of paintings that I did. So here's a couple of them. Strange Fruit mini comics. Here's the one that's got me with a picture of Joe Biden on the back. So I started making these mini comics and started selling them. And when I was selling the comics of Henry Box Brown, as like this like this one complete story, like I had a beginning, a middle, an end, a start and a finish, a spark. I had everything about a narrative arc that's already set up. And so it was a good way for me to learn how to draw comics. So I drew the story. And then I put it together in a book called Strange Fruit, and then I went and started selling it at a comic convention. And as I was there, people would ask me new questions like, have you ever heard of Harry Bucky Lew? And I'd say, no, I have never heard of Harry Bucky Lew. Well, Harry Bucky Lew was the first Black basketball player to play in a team in the United States. He played in Lowell, Massachusetts, and he was there in 1902. He was the first Black basketball player. He made like, I think $5 a day for basketball. And there was actually a situation in which there was the coach of the team wasn't going to play him. One of their team members got hurt, and he was going to play with 4 people because he didn't want to play the Black kid. And then the entire audience started screaming, put the Black kid in, put the Black kid in. So they ended up putting them in the game. And this was when basketball was much rougher. Like they wore pads, and it was more like tackling to get the ball away from people. There was no dribbling. So I drew this, I researched it, and then I drew that story. And then I had 2 comics to sell. I had Strange Fruit 1 and Strange Fruit 2. And then somebody would tell me, have you ever heard of Major Taylor? And I'm like, no. Well, Major Taylor was called the Black Cyclone. He was he was the first African-American world champion in any sport. In 1899, he held 7 world records for cycling. He's called the Black Cyclone. He was all these different things. He was really amazing. So I researched him, and then I did that story. While I was working on another story, I was at a comic book convention, indie comic conventions, because there are different types of indie conventions, right? Comic conventions. Like most people don't realize this. They think they all are the same. But so you get the mainstream comic conventions, and most people are dressed up like Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, the Avengers, or whatever, right? The indie comic book conventions, most people are kind of dressed up like Doctor Who, but they're not really cosplaying. That's just how they dress. So like that's the difference between those 2 types of conventions. And so I'm at the ones with Doctor Who because I figure hipsters will spend $9 for avocado on toast. They'll buy these interesting comics about Black people, right? So that's what I was doing. I was selling comics about Black people, and somebody from my former publisher, Fulcrum, came by, and they were like, and bought everything on the table, went back to their hotel room, read everything, came back and was like, oh my God, this is great. We need to buy these books. We need to get you a book contract. And I was like, really? And they were like, yeah. By Tuesday, that following Tuesday, that was like on a Saturday, by following Tuesday, I had a book contract for Strange Fruit. And in the process of doing that, I was lucky enough to get Henry Louis Gates Jr. to write the foreword for the book, which really all it took was me to find his email, an email that went directly to him. And he answered it and was very gracious and wrote the foreword to the book. And as we were doing this, the publisher wanted me to do more books. And so I felt like I had a pretty good handle on how to tell a story, like short stories. So then I wanted to tell a longer story. And I'd done a short story about Bass Reeves in Strange Fruit. And I wanted to do a longer one. And my publisher was like, that's great. We can call these African-American action stories. And I'm like, no, we cannot, because that is stupid. I had just finished reading an essay by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Talented Tenth, and it's about 10% of the Black population reaching down and bringing the rest of the population up. And W.E.B. Du Bois said we needed that sort of like 10% to sort of bring us up. And I was like, that's a really good idea. So why don't we just call it Tales of the Talented Tenth? And he was like, that's a better title. And I'm like, I know. So I did another book about Bass Reeves, Tales of the Talented Tenth. And so these books came out about 6 months apart, maybe 7 months apart. And then I was reading the reviews for Strange Fruit. And one of the reviews for Strange Fruit was that somebody had written on a blog or written on my blog post or something. They were like, it's deplorable that you would let such a misogynistic book get out into the world or something. And, my first thought was to like, rail, like, I'm not misogynist. That's not what I've done. And then and it was like, because there's no women in Strange Fruit Volume 1, and the stories were told to me. So it wasn't a situation in which I was like specifically seeking to eliminate women from the stories. It was just the way the stories had come to me. But the end result is that I didn't include women. So it doesn't really matter what the end result is, what my intention was. The end result is that there are no women in it. And so instead of arguing with these people about there should be women or not, what they should, I just said, I'm sorry. I'll make sure that I fix that next time, because I feel like if you want to be something, I can't just say I'm not misogynist. I actually have to be anti-misogynist and be more inclusive. So that's what I did. So, the next book I wrote was about Bessie Stringfield, who was the first Black woman to crisscross the United States on a motorcycle. She did it in the 1930s and 40s. And so I drew an entire story about her, and I fell in love with Bessie's story and wanted to spend more time on it. So it was around this time that I started pitching the idea of a children's book. And while that was permeating out in the world, I did a second volume of Strange Fruit with more uncelebrated narratives for Black history. And as you can imagine, instead of just using the stories that people had just given me at this point, I started researching stories about Black women so that I can include Black women into these stories. So I did that. And so Strange Fruit has, I think half of the stories in Strange Fruit are Black women. And about this time, I sold the rights to do a picture book. So if you ever decide you want to be a cartoonist and you want to draw comics, one of the things you have to do is I would suggest doing cartoons, doing comics, and picture books, because picture books will take you less than half the time to make, and they will pay twice as much. That's just the way it works. And so I did the picture book, Fast Enough, Bessie Stringfield's First Ride, which was a fictionalized story of Bessie Stringfield as a little girl. She's in this neighborhood with all these boys, and the little boys are saying, you can't race with us because you're not fast enough. And so Bessie said, I am fast enough. And so she went on to, Bessie went on to, in the story, she goes on to win the race and beat the boys at the race. At the same time, I was working on fights. So at this point, I felt like it was a really good idea to go back to telling my own personal story. And instead of using a fictionalized version of my life, I decided to tell a straightforward version of my life. And it was based on a couple of things. The first thing is that it was based on, I just finished reading two books, which are two really interesting books to actually juxtapose against. And one of them is Guts by Raina Telgemeier. If you don't know, not Guts, but Smile by Raina Telgemeier. Raina Telgemeier is like the queen of graphic novels, right? She makes comics that are for like tweens, like 8 to 12-year-old girls. If you, in the publishing industry, if your publisher prints 20,000 copies of your books to sell, that's a New York Times bestseller. Like, that's going to be great. Like, they have a lot of confidence in that book. That means that the bankers and the financial people are all sitting back going like this, like they're excited about that. Raina Telgemeier's last book, which was a book called Guts, before that book even left the shop, they printed 1 million copies of that book, just to give you a sense of how many books they're selling. Most really good books are 20,000 copies. They printed 1 million copies for that book. Her books are so successful that the New York Times bestseller for graphic novels list came back specifically because her books were outselling everything. So they made a separate list for it because they didn't want it at the top of the list. They wanted it on a separate list altogether. So I read that book, and in that book, Smile is told through like the narrative vehicle, the plot device is like dental work. Raina gets into an accident when she's a kid and she loses her front 2 teeth. And then she has to do a lot of dental work over the course of the rest of her life, her adolescence, in order to do that. So I read that book. At the same time, I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. If you haven't read it, it's a letter. It's a call and response, basically, to James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. James Baldwin wrote a letter to his nephew, and Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a letter to his son. And both of them are pretty much about the same thing: racism in America. And Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about this idea about protecting the Black body. And like when you are a Black man in America, you are constantly protecting your body. What does that mean, to constantly protect your body? It means that as a Black man, there are multiple stages in your life where violence is just prominent. For me, it was like there were just neighborhoods I didn't go in. There was a mall that I didn't go to because, like, if I didn't have enough pull, like enough people with me, then I might get jumped. There were streets that I wouldn't go on to, and I didn't sell drugs or I wasn't in a gang. It's just like this was just my natural life. Like there were parties you wouldn't go to unless that. And Ta-Nehisi Coates explained it in such a way that I had never really thought about that in of my, like how I had like lived my life. And shortly thereafter, I read a story. I was in the car with my son and I just picked him up. And I live in New Boston, New Hampshire. I'm about an hour away from Boston. But I typically call New Boston White Conda. I am one of 3 Black people in my town, if you don't count my children. But I call it White Conda. And so we're coming back from school one day and my son tells me that there was a fight at school. And I said, that's interesting. There was a fight. Like, that's crazy. And he was like, yeah. And then immediately I think to myself, I need to teach, like, has he ever gotten into a fight? So I asked him, have you ever been in a fight? And he goes, no, I've never been in a fight. And immediately in that short conversation, I started thinking to myself, I have to make sure this kid knows how to fight. Because what if he has to come up with that? And then I go through every single fight that I've been into. And when I was fighting as a kid, I was dealing with, abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, trauma, death, dealing with all these different things. And so like that was my output. Violence was my output because as a child, you don't know how to talk, right? So your violence is your output. And so, but my son, Christian, hadn't had any of that, right? He had had a completely different lifestyle. And so I immediately think to myself, oh my God, I got to teach you how to fight. And then I'm like, you know what? I've fought enough for both of us. Don't have to worry about it. And he's like, good talk, Dad. And so when I looked at going back and trying to tell my story, I thought, this is a really good way to tell the story, is to use the fights to sort of build the narrative, kind of like Raina Telgemeier's Smile, but also with this nod to Ta-Nehisi Coates and like the idea that you have to protect your body. So I went back and I drew Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence, which came out last year, right before the panorama struck. So this is the book that I call my love letter to kids who grew up like me, because it was, children's literature is about 2 things in a lot of ways. It's about windows and about mirrors. And mirrors are books that when you look in the mirror, you see yourself, right? Those are mirror books. And windows are when you can look in the window and you can see what it's like to be someone else. And I think in a lot of ways, I drew Fights to be a mirror and a window. I drew it for kids who grew up like I did so that they can see that they're not alone, that they are special, but their problems aren't. And for people who deal with kids like this so that they can look in and see what it's like, what those kids have gone through, because a lot of times people don't know what those kids have gone through before they get to school that morning. So I drew Fights and put that out into the world. And so then I went on to, this book will be out next year. This book will be out in May. This is the 3rd in the volume of Tales of the Talented Tenth. This is about Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was he was an enslaved African who stole the Confederate warship, the USS Planter, and then sailed it through Confederate waters to the Union and gave it up. Then he became a war hero. He became a veteran of the Union Army. He saved some people's lives. He ran for Congress. He was a congressman. He actually wrote one of the first laws during Reconstruction that actually that funded compulsory free education for everybody in America. And then he founded the South Carolina Republican Party. And then he bought the plantation that he was enslaved on. And then, if that wasn't enough, he let his former master live on the plantation with him. So he was an all around, just like an amazing individual. So I just finished that story. And now I am working on the graphic novel adaptation of Professor Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. So that's what's taking up my life all day, every day right now. So So just to conclude, what is a cartoonist? A cartoonist is a person who writes and draws stories. So when you think about this process, it is not one or the other. It is both of those things coming together to create something that neither one of those things can create alone. And so that's what I spend most of my time doing when I'm not teaching. So that's my spiel, and I'm happy to answer questions about comics and the work, the universe, and everything else.
I think it's very inspiring at the fact that your story kind of like continues as you reflect on the feedback or people around you. It just kind of impacted the way you thought or like change your pathways. It was very like in the moment, which is, I think, really rare. I'm pretty sure that convention is, like you said, like after they asked you, do you know who this is? You go home and look these things up. I feel like that's something that is so powerful, because when someone introduces me, or like how I would say put me on to something new, or introduce me to something new, and you give it a chance, like that your whole story was like, wow, like I'm gonna do that. Like if someone has something to say, I'm gonna listen for it, you know?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I try to think about specifically as a creative is I try to love the process. I can't always dictate the outcome, but like I can't tell you how like much fun it is for me to be researching and reading. Like I go down the rabbit hole of like reading like esoteric papers about individual history. Like I'm not saying everybody's going to do that. That's just me, right? I'm like reading these like papers out of the Midwest, out of this some little tiny school in this peer-reviewed journal about causes for the Civil War, that, you know, like the only way that Abraham Lincoln could have freed the enslaved Africans in the Confederate States is that if they actually seceded, because they were no longer part of the United States. And so he could dictate to them, like all these different things, right? And so like I try to fall in love with the process. And part of it is like my philosophy of like trying to live in this moment. Like we don't have yesterday and we're not promised tomorrow. And so in order to really be present in the moments, you just have to deal with the things that are right in front of you. And so like with my process, it's like I can't like the book is done, right? It's in the past, like it's done, or it's in the future and it's not done. So the only thing that I could do is like really love making these panel transitions work. Really love the way that the words and the pictures come together. So really just staying in the moment, and that's what I try to do with all of these things. And that's kind of how I try to live my life, is like in this one moment, because nothing else matters.
So, thank you.
You're welcome. Where do you get your inspiration from? So inspiration is a really interesting thing. Just about the creative process in general, inspiration is there's this really, I don't know who said this. I don't know if it was Stephen King or Chuck Close or somebody, but they always say the same person. And it's like, they always say the same thing. And it's like, inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just get to work. Because that's what happens if you wait around for inspiration. I think what most people do when they create something creative is like, this is what I think is dope. I'm going to make some dope things. So if I'm going to put it out in the world, and I just hope that there are other people who think the same thing that I think is dope is the same thing that they think is dope as well. That's legitimately what you do, right? You just make things that you like. There are people who are making art, for trying to don't think about what sells, right? Don't think about what sells or think about what's marketable, because people can smell that. Like that's the things that you guys are seeking. You will see that it's fake, right? It's like no passion. Like I believe that your work ethic is passion plus hustle, right? It's those two things. You can hustle, you can have passion. Those two things are fine on their own. You know, people who hustle, they're doing a lot of different things. They are your uncle who is always successful, but he is the CEO of a bunch of stuff, right? He's written books. He's a motivational speaker. He's working in the gym. He's got his he's doing all these different things. He hustles, but he has no passion because he's just looking for the next hustle. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are a lot of people who live their life like that. And I am not trying to clown them at all. And then there are people who are passionate. They are super passionate, but they don't hustle at all. Those are the people that could talk to you for hours and hours and hours about something. And then you say, well, why don't you do it? And they're just like, I don't really know. Yeah, you know, those kind of people. The people who are super successful are the people who are really passionate about something and they really hustle. And when you see that hustle and passion, you see that thing that they can talk to you for hours about in the middle of the night, when you're about to get out of your car, those are the people that's the person that you want to be, right? That person that can talk about everything, and then you're going to go and work on those things. And so I think that is what you have to do, is you have to combine passion and hustle. And so like, I'm passionate about these ideas. Like I'm passionate about sharing stories. Like, and when you look at the body of my work, most of it is nonfiction. And then you got memoir, you got my memoir in there, but like my memoir relates to what I'm talking about, right? So I'm drawing stories about Black people in America, and then I draw a really personal story. I just happen to be the Black person that I'm talking about in America. So I'm talking about me and how I live. So I think that you just have to like make what you love. And that's do what you love and then work hard at it. I think somebody in the inspiration said 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration is exactly right. Like, I'm not the most talented person from my graduate school class. Like the 2 years I was there, I'm not the most talented person. I am the most successful. I'm not the most talented person in the school that I went. Like every situation, I'm not the most talented, but I worked really, really hard, much harder than I think all the rest of those people. Let's see. That was like a 2-part question. Do you feel your style reflects yourself? Yeah. My style is, so when you are young, don't focus on style, focus on getting better, right? So never say to yourself, I don't do that, it's not my style. Just focus on getting better. And I think that's the way you have to think about it, is don't think about like your style. Like style comes along, right? It's kind of like if you look at the way you dress right now, you didn't wake up one day and go, I am only going to wear a plaid shirt and a beanie. That's all I'm going to wear. You don't do that, right? It gradually progresses, right? You wear something, you're like, this looks good on me, and you keep doing it. This color looks good on me. I'm going to keep wearing it. All of those stuff progresses over time until eventually you have like a specific way in which you dress, right? That's just you, right? It's your style. But it's not always like a really specific thing, because if you had a really specific idea, you've all gone to the store and bought that shirt that does not look good on you, or that color that you just like won't rock that color at all, right? You've all done that. We all have. So I think it's really important to not think about style and just like think about getting better. And that's what I try to do. If you look at Strange Fruit Volume 1, the first story in Strange Fruit Volume 1 is the first published comic that I have. And then you look at Fights and you see that that's the last published comic. And if you look at those two things side by side, you can see the similarities, but you can also see that I've gotten better. Like the same person, I would not draw the story of Henry Box Brown the same way that I drew Fights. The same way that I drew it then that I would draw it now. It wouldn't work the same way. So I would do something different. Let's see. How do you balance stories of pain and joy? By just telling the truth. I think that's truth, and I say truth with a capital T for me, right? Not truth like a universal truth, but it's just like a truth for me. My story, my path is not somebody else's path. And one of the things, it was really interesting. It's funny that you asked that question about pain and joy, is because when I was drawing Fights, when I started drawing it and we were selling it, and my editor, who was really excited about it, wanted me to talk to the acquisitions team at the company that I was selling Fights to. And she was like, I am a white woman and I don't know how to explain the story about a Black man to these people. So she's like, could you explain it? And so I met with the acquisitions team. And one of the things which was really difficult, and I still, like, this stuck in my head, I'll probably never forget this as long as I live, is that one of the people said, do you feel uncomfortable placing Black people this close to violence? And I said, I'm not placing Black people this close to violence. I am placing myself this close to violence. And it was funny that this was a Black woman, and she was trying to make me take responsibility for all Black people, which I still resent. Like, I'm still salty about it. Like, I see her at places, and she's she's really famous. Y'all would know her if you saw her. But I talk to her. I see her all the time at places, but that's still in the back of my mind, like her trying to get me to take responsibility for all Black people, because it's just my story, right? And I'm just trying to tell the truth, because I feel like this is a truth that, you know, a lot of people don't talk about. Specifically, Black men don't talk about sexual trauma, right? Grown, cis, straight Black men don't talk about this. And I felt like it was important for me to talk about it because, you know, it opens it up to not be an accepted thing, but to be something that we can talk about, because we can only talk about it and get through it together. And so I felt it was important to do that. But I will say that as I was drawing fights, I felt like it was a slog, right? It was like one traumatic thing after another traumatic thing after another. And so I went back in and I started adding some other things. So if you read fights, there's this whole thing with a Cabbage Patch doll that me and my friends thought were possessed. Like there was a thing in the 80s, guys. I'm just take my word for it. Everybody thought Cabbage Patch dolls were possessed, and we were kids. And so we all thought they were possessed, and everybody was afraid of them. It was really, it was a thing. So we have a whole episode of that in the book. There's this episode of this farmer who lived next to us, who was really, really nice to me. And when I look back on it, I realized that he wasn't necessarily nice. He was just like, this is just what normal people do for kids. Which is really great. And so I do that. I put that story in there. I talk about chess a lot, because chess and hip hop and drawing comics were the three things that saved me in a lot of ways, made me choose different things. And so that's pretty much how I balance that, if that makes sense. How do you acknowledge that and tell the stories of progress in spite of hardship? So I think when you think about, the truth, and when I say truth, I mean like the truth in history, the truth in society, is that, I have to explain this in terms of Tom and Jerry. If you've seen Tom and Jerry recently, right, any of the old Tom and Jerry's, you know that they have edited a lot of stuff out, right? Because there was a lot of racism and a lot of misogyny and a lot of that stuff in there, right? So they edit those things out so that they show Tom and Jerry as a pure form. I am against that. And the reason that I am against that is not because of censorship, is because it doesn't show how common racism was and how so embedded it was in society that they would just put it in random kids' cartoons, right? And so when you remove that, you're basically telling us, you're basically whitewashing history to say it wasn't that bad back then. Look at these things. Because I think if you can see Uncle Remus tales and you can see how prevalent and how racism and misogyny and homophobia was just a common everyday thing, then you will see how much progress we make, right? It means that history is clearer when you show the trials and tribulations that we've been in. We are a better country because we've made the decision to do things differently, not because we've chosen to think that it was better in the past, because we know it wasn't, right? And so I think when you look at history, I think that's the way you have to think about it. Like, we have a tendency to, revere the founding fathers, who were a group of white, wealthy 1% men who basically took crap in buckets at night and raped their slaves, right? Like, these are the people that we revere, right? Whereas what we should be saying is that these were talented heart surgeons who were able to fix our heart, but also in the process, they sewed a watch into our chest, right? That doesn't mean we don't say that our heart is better. It just means that we need to pull the watch out of our chest. And that's actually acknowledging both of those things, right? And I think that that's what we have to do when we talk about any kind of history, any kind of things, trials and tribulations of Black people. I think Black people are incredible because of how far we've come, right? We went from basically being ledgers, like entries on a ledger, right? Property, like my great-great-grandfather was listed on a document in Southwestern Virginia as Black Buck, age 20, right? That's the way he was listed. He wasn't even a human, right? And now I am a professor. Like, that's a huge jump, right? And some people have gone further than that. So I think that it's important to look at where we've come and how far we've come, not look at where we are individually or spend most of the time on. I think we need to look at those things collaboratively. I hope that answers that question. Does that answer that question? How can someone collaborate with you? I don't know. it's really difficult. I have so many projects right now. I'm just like, it's funny. My wife and my kids. I have 4 kids and they're all adults. But somebody will send me a message saying, do you want to come and do this thing? And I'm like, oh my God, it's just one more person I have to answer. And my daughter is like, oh, must be hard to be you and all those people calling you and wanting you to come out. And I'm like, yeah, it's like, yeah, I wish I had more time. I don't have very much time. I'm working on this big book. I'm working on other stuff. I don't really have much time to collaborate. Is that question, do I write stories for other people? Is that what that question is? Do you write stories for other people? Because I haven't.
That was my question. It was like a kind of a combo question with a collab question. And you kind of talked about like someone else giving you an idea and whether, what your perspective is on the idea and where you would go with, where you feel like you need to go with it if you're going to take it. So
yeah, like so people gave me ideas. When I say people gave me ideas, it was more like, have you ever heard of this person? And so they would tell me who that person is, and then I would go research them. Okay. Which happens all the time. Like it happens. Like I was New Hampshire Chronicle did a piece on me for Black History Month. So I was on TV in New Hampshire. And so legitimately my social media is blowing up with people like, have you heard of this person from this little town? Have you heard of this person from this little town? So I got a whole new list of people. Every time somebody comes up to me or I do a lecture, they're like, have you ever heard of this person? So I end up doing more stories about those people. At some point, people will start telling these stories and I can go write Black science fiction, which is what I really want to write. So, is it easier to write about yourself or writing about others? I don't know if one's easier than the other. When I was writing Fights, I was writing it as if I was someone else. So I was writing it in a way in which I was saying, Joel is doing this thing or little Joel is doing that. So I try to be really objective about it because that's the only way you can write about it. Like, I think people misunderstand how the art making process works. And people think, well, if you're angry, you'll make angry stuff. Or if you're sad, you'll make sad stuff. No, you'll make bad stuff if you're sad because you're not really thinking. You're really just sad at that moment. So you actually have to step away from those things and you have to think critically about what you're feeling and how you can make people feel. Like, how do you create solitude in a panel? How do you create solitude in a painting? How do you do those kind of things? And so like, that's the way I sort of think about it. So separating myself from it and writing as if I am a different person is just the same. And I'm sure there are as many people. I mean, creativity and creative path is all really interesting about in terms of how people tend to do things differently. Like some things work for some people, some things don't. So, do you ever feel burnt out? Does work get in the way of you enjoying what you're doing? I mean, no. I mean, I honestly, like, I teach comics, I draw comics, I write about comics. My wife says, like the times when I get upset, when I'm like stressed about somebody wanting to collaborate with me or wanting to work with me, I think to myself, how many people would just like die to be in the position that I am right now. Like, I just did a comic for the Boston Globe. And they reached out and they were like, we'd love for you to start doing some regular cartoons for us. And anything you want to pitch to us is fine, right? So basically the Boston Globe was like, we want you to do your thing for us and we will print it. And that was like stressful for me. I ain't got time for this. I got other stuff I got to be doing. I ain't got time to be thinking about this. And so like at those times, I just have to think to myself, like, live in the moment. Like, this is what, if you had told 10-year-old Joel, who was reading Cracked and Mad magazine, that one day people will be reaching out of the woodworks asking you to draw comics for them, what I would have thought of, I would have been really super excited. Like, I can't wait to get there. And I wouldn't be, 46-year-old Joel going, man, I don't want to talk to people. Like, I wouldn't be the same person. So, I mean, I do get burnt out, but it usually only lasts a moment. Mostly because I really love drawing. Like, it's my favorite thing to do. So I had shoulder surgery like 2 years ago from drawing fights. I messed my shoulder up. And And I put it off as long as I possibly could so that I could continue to work. And so I had the surgery, and it was an outpatient surgery. So they did it and they brought me home. I was in bed. You get all those painkillers, and I had in a sling. I passed out in my living room, like everything else. And my mom, who lives in a little in-law apartment across the carport, came over to the house like the third day. Like the second day, I was completely slept most of the day. The third day, I was just up and I had the sling, and I immediately started drawing. Like that was the next thing I was doing. And my mom was like, "Should you be drawing?" And I'm like, "I'm drawing with my wrist, Mom. I'm drawing." I'm like, "I'm not moving my shoulder. I'm drawing with my wrist." So it's my favorite thing to do. So I do still paint. I don't paint as much as I don't have time for the most part to paint. Just to answer that question really fast. I'd love to paint. I just don't have time. I'm like working on other stuff. Like these comics won't draw themselves is what I say all the time. Like I'm sitting upstairs with my family and they're like, "Where are you going, Dad?" I'm like, "I'm going downstairs because these comics won't draw themselves." So that's one thing. I'm glad they don't draw themselves because then I'd be out of the job.
What advice do you have for high schoolers who are interested in pursuing a career in comics or graphic novels or things like that?
Advice to high school students. So there's a couple things that I would say. First of all, there's nothing wrong with copying manga. There's nothing wrong with it. Draw as much manga as you possibly can. I would just challenge you to draw backgrounds, because that's the thing you don't draw, is you don't draw backgrounds. It's always like somebody with a giant sword sitting in an empty big space. Like draw them on the toilet, draw them at the coffee shop, draw them in a bedroom, draw them somewhere, draw them in spaces. Learn to draw characters in spaces. That's number one. So also, don't just copy manga, right? So think about, you guys have all probably seen really bad memes that have been shared and shared and shared and shared, and they're like blurry and you can't really read the words in the picture. Like you've seen it so many different times. Like you've all seen that, like a meme that's been shared so many times that it's blurry. Well, it's because it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, right? So when you draw manga, if you're like, how do you draw a nose? And you open up your favorite manga. Here's one of my favorites. You open up your favorite manga and you flip to this page and you're like, okay, this is how they draw your nose. I'm going to draw a nose like that. Then you're actually drawing a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, because Mitsuki, this is a comic called My Grandpa Was an Eyeball, which is really great. Anyway, so he spent years developing a style to make this a character. So he's drawn multiple noses, real life noses, and he simplified them down until he got to this point, right? So when you copy that, it's the copy of the copy. So go back to the original, learn how the real nose works, and then simplify it and come up with your own style. That way you'll actually develop much more of a you thing, as opposed to I'm just drawing Misaki. Like you don't want that to be the thing that you do. So draw from life just to get a sense of like reality and how that stuff works, but don't use the reality. So for example, if you're trying to draw a hand and you're trying to make it hold on to something and it's like this, right? You can use this as the guide, draw this, but then don't look at this anymore. Look at your drawing of this and simplify it and keep simplifying it. I always tell one of the assignments that I do and when I teach an introduction to comics class is to draw a fire hydrant, draw it 5 minutes, then draw it 2.5 minutes, then draw it in a minute, and then draw it in 30 seconds until you can draw it in 10 seconds, and do that like all in one setting, right? And then look at the first one and look at the last one. And what did you like learn in the process of simplifying it to this point? So that's what I would say. Do you have a book list? Yes. Books that everybody should read, which is always really hard. But if you want to draw comics, you should definitely read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. This book is, if you're a visual artist in any way, shape, or form, you should read this book because it's about how visual language works. So this is one, read this one. This is like the first. And so like a book list is, it's hard. Like, what are some things, it's like if you like science fiction, you might, there's a new book that just came out by a friend of mine, Tim Fielder, Infinitum. This is a really good Black science. It's Afrofuturism. So this is a good one to read if you like science fiction. If you like mystery, well, there's a book that's like mystery and LGBTQIA plus issues at the same time called Kiss Number 8, which is created by two friends of mine, Ellen Crenshaw and Colleen Venerable. Kiss Number 8 is incredible. It was longlisted for the New York Times Book Award a couple years ago when it came out. So I would suggest that one. And then it goes like, depending on like genre. If you like memoir, you could read Mouse. You could read March by John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell. Those are memoir. If you like science fiction, Infinitum is good. If you like, there's Kindred, which is a really good graphic novel that a friend of mine wrote, John Jennings and Damien Duffy. Kindred and Parable of the Sower, like looking at mine. If you like history, Kindred is good. It's Black Panther Party just came out, which is a really good book. I read that one. It's Kindred, not Ken. It's Ken, Kindred. Kindred. The book Bone is really good. If you like adventure, it's all age adventure. I don't really like the colored version. They colored it after they did it black and white because it was originally supposed to be just a black and white comic, but they colored it. But you might like it colored. I don't like it. But that's a good one. How many is that?
That was great. I think that was my question earlier. Okay. And that was also a combo question too, because you were listing, like you were showing all of your books too. And I have children. So I put the question, like what grade level your books are at, like if we wanted to suggest we have our students here, but I'm like just stealing all of the knowledge right now. So all of my books are for the most part all ages except for Fights. And I still think Fights is all ages because the kids who grew up like me, like the 8, 9, and 10-year-olds that grew up like I did, have been through probably the exact same things that I have in this book. So it won't be it won't be traumatic to them because I'm dealing with, like I said, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and trauma. So like, and the language is what I grew up hearing. So the language in the book is that. So like that one's a little bit more like if you have a mature kid and you feel like it's okay for that kid to read it, like just make sure that you're ready to be answering questions. But for the rest of the books, Strange Fruit and Tales of the Talented Tenth are all ages. Thank you. Are your books online?
You can find them. You can find them online. You can find them through the publisher. You can get them at bookstores. If you're in Cambridge, you can get everything at Million Year Picnic. They have all of my books at Million Year Picnic. A bunch of the comic book stores in Boston have my stuff. So,
in the virtual world, do you have audio? Are the books audio?
I don't think any. No, I would know that. No, none of my books are audio. Oh, New Kid, that's another one. New Kid by Jerry Craft. Jerry's also a friend of mine. That book came out. He won the Newbery for his first graphic novel to win the Newbery Prize for children's literature. So that's another one that's really, really fantastic. And the next one, it's the First Class, I think is the second one. But that one's really, really good. What would you say to people who feed into the stereotype of starving artists? They're starving accountants. They really are. They're people with business and master's degrees in like ridiculous stuff that work at McDonald's too. I would just say, it's funny, like when at my previous institution, I was drawing comics and this time I was drawing on my iPad. I draw on my iPad and my Cintiq, but I had like a Mobile Studio Pro, which is like a all-in-one computer Cintiq thing that they used to sell. I'm sure they still sell them. But I was drawing on it and this professor walks by and he goes, oh, like he's a painting professor. He's chair of our painting department. He goes, is that what you draw your little cartoons on? Like he does this little motion. Right? And I'm like, and I legitimately was like, the New York Times has written about my little cartoons. Have they written about your paintings? Because yeah, like there are starving, like if you hustle, you can do this, right? Like this is a thing you can do, but you have to hustle. This is not a situation in which you can sit around waiting for stuff to happen, because you can't wait for it. If you want to be the CEO of a company, you can't wait for it. There's no clear path. If you get a degree in engineering and you're like, I want to be the CEO of a technology company someday, those are not people who just sit and wait. My wife is this chief solutions officer for a healthcare IT company, and she did not sit and wait for somebody to anoint her, right? Being a woman in business, that's not a thing that's going to happen. People aren't going to come by and go, boop, you're a CSO. Like, it's not going to happen. You got to ask for it. You got to advocate for it. You got to do that. And then you have to do the exact same thing with your work, no matter what it is. And you also have to figure out where the people are. So it's kind of like, if you think about your output, whatever it is, music, books, paintings, art, whatever it is, like your output. If you are selling a widget, you have to figure out where the people are who are going to buy your widget. And at that point, all the regular business models, all of that stuff all applies, right? Marketing, getting to the right people, finding the right place, all that stuff works. And so basically figure out who's going to buy your widget and find those people and then connect with those people. In the beginning, my people were hipsters who would spend $9 on avocado toast, right? And then as the publisher decided, it was like, teachers will really like this. And then I learned that librarians were a really big part of this. It's just like, those are my people. So usually when people want me to come and talk, if it's a library or school, if it's a school library, perfect. I'm always going to talk to those people because I know that those are my people. You only need 1,000 true fans. And 1,000 true fans is this thing that created by this woman named Spike Trotman, who is a cartoonist and comic book publisher in Chicago. She's like I think she's the only Black woman who owns a comic book company. But she's Iron Spike on Twitter. And she says you only need 1,000 true fans. So that means that you don't need millions of people to love you and to know who you are. You only need 1,000. And you need 1,000 people who will spend $100 on your output every year. That's all. That is $100,000 a year. That is a good living for a good life. Because I think a lot of people think you need like millions of fans. No. You just need 1,000. You need 1,000 people who are your fans. If you can find that, you're going to be good. Yes, I have met Raina Telgemeier. She is a very lovely person. She and I were at Baltimore Comic-Con together, and we were in the artist alley at Baltimore Comic-Con. And it was not the kind of Comic-Con that we typically like, because Raina's basically an indie cartoonist who just made it big too. But it's not really like indie cartoonist place, right? It's for people who draw superheroes. So even though Raina Telgemeier is mainstream comics, she was just as lonely as I was at this table. So we ended up it was Raina was there, I was there, and No Brow Books, which is a small art comics publisher. We basically just started taking pictures of the most interesting cosplay. That's what we spent our day doing. And there was I can't tell you, there was a quest. There was this grown man, he's probably in his 50s, who was in really good shape, who dressed like the old school Tarzan. He just had a loincloth on and sneakers. And I was trying my best to get a picture with him, and I never did. I chased him down. It was like he was like my white whale, right? I was going all over this comic book place to get a picture with him. I saw him, and I'm like, I get a picture with him. It was like he was taunting me. I went to the 3D little anime. They make these little 3D toys of yourself. There's a 3D printer in the scan. I walked past it. There's a picture, giant picture of Tarzan, right? As I leave, and I'm on the other side of the convention, my publicist texts me, and she texts me a picture of herself with Tarzan. So I run back to try to get a picture with Tarzan. Still can't get it. Never did get a picture with Tarzan. I'm still salty.
Do you collect anything besides He-Man?
Sneakers. But it's a sad time to be a sneakerhead because nobody can see, my really dope collection. I just got a pair of look. I think I wore them twice. I just got a pair of these, right? These are like super rare. Like nobody, like very few people have these, and nobody's seen them. Nobody's seen these. I have like 2 pair of really great sneakers that I wore out the house, but like nobody sees my sneakers, and they're just like, nope. Levi 4s, yep. I got Levi 4s. I got the 4 off Nor. I just got those. Yeah, sneakers. To my wife's chagrin. I have a pair of Jordan 1s, and a friend of mine, Stacy Robinson, who was he's at University of Illinois, but he was a Harvard fellow last year. And when we first met, I had my Jordan 1s on, the Chicago's, and he walked up to me. He was like, "What size are those?" He's like, "What size are those?" I'm like, "My size." Yep, those are fighting words. What size are those? Exactly. About to throw hands.
All right. Well, thank you, Joel, so much for coming by and
you're very welcome
and being so generous. We really appreciated hearing from you, hearing about your life and your art and all the cool things that you do. So if everyone who wants to, if you want to unmute yourself to say thank you, we're right in the chat. Let's say goodbye to Joel.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.